Professor Nielsen can say a bit more about this. Welcome to this lecture with Laïla Bokhari and Jorgen Nielsen on the topic of migration, religion, and secularism. You know me, if you've been following the series, you know me by now. I'm Peter Burgess. I'm a fellow at the Institute of European Studies across the street, and also a research professor at the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And this whole project, of course, is a collaboration between the IES and the Institute in Oslo, as well as the Center for Law, Science, Technology, and Society Studies here at the DUB. My co-organizer, Serge Kupet, sends his apologies. He's met him before, I suppose. He couldn't be with us, but sends his greetings. This is the 8th lecture in the series of 12, and for many reasons, it's the center of gravity of the entire series. In some sense, the series of 12 lectures was formed around the theme of tonight, and I want to say a few words about that by way of introduction. Because you notice the title of the series, Europe Under Threat, with a question mark, Security, Migration, and Integration. This theme was formulated in some sense based on the observation that immense political power, immense resources, both financial and human, have built activities upon the notion that Europe is threatened by migration in one way or another. And of course, migration from the developing world to Europe. So if we look at the way that security in Europe is focused and concentrated, both in terms of finances and in terms of political organization, it's very much about migration. The European Union does not have a common foreign security policy like the United States or like any nation-state entity. No. It has one which is a bit in search of its identity, and that identity has landed on, focused on migration. So we wanted to ask the question, what does this mean to be threatened by migration? What does it mean to make migration the focus of security investment and security political activity? So that was really the heart and soul of the entire series, and then we built the different themes around exactly that. And this didn't come without a bit of resistance. When we had a project group to develop the program for this series, there was resistance against this title, Europe Under Threat. Considerable resistance, actually, and we had to argue to keep it, based on the idea, really a methodological idea, that we should call it like we see it, identify the way that the discourse of security in Europe is dominated by migration, and then try to critique it, try to analyze it, unpack it, and understand it better. But the counter-argument was, well, no, we should focus on the fact that for most people, Europe is not under threat. For enlightened people, for we, the politically correct academic community, Europe is not under threat, and it's not serving Europe by formulating the title the way it is. So that was the sort of discussion we had, and this was then highlighted by the fact that the original title of tonight's lecture, it was something different than what it is on the program today. Today we have Migration, Religion, and Secularism. The original title in the program was Civilizational Security, Islam as a Threat to Europe. And again, based on the idea that, well, this is the idea that motivates much political activity and financial activity in the security sector in Europe. So let's focus on it and critique it. And there was resistance to this, and among other things, I got an email from a colleague, an academic colleague, a friend from France, which I want to read to you. I want the person can remain anonymous. This is a sociologist in France who writes, as a social scientist and as a European citizen, I'm extremely puzzled at the underlying ideology of the whole program, the whole lecture series, and particularly to this title, Civilizational Security, Islam as a Threat to Europe. What is this supposed to mean? We are scholars, have a collective responsibility not to vehiculate and to reinforce the rudest, racist, contemporary ideas. I hope no speaker will be confirmed and allow his or her name to be associated with such nonsense. I sincerely hope you will assume the responsibility to withdraw it, which, as you know, I did. out of guilt, cowardice, political correctness, or whatever you can decide yourself. So this anecdote is also a kind of confession about the foolish title I first gave this, the lecture this evening. But again, it's kind of a methodological question. On what level should we place our gaze? On the one of what we want to be ideologically arguing for, that we should not feel threatened by Islam, or by what kind of idea is in circulation and motivates a lot of thinking about migration, about Islam, and about security in Europe. So on that introductory confession, if you like, let me introduce our two speakers this evening. Both of them have CVs characterized by breadth and long and very, very diverse experience. Let me start with Laïla Bokhari, who is a research fellow within the Afghanistan and Pakistan program of the Department of Security and Crisis of Management of the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, otherwise known as NUPI, in my hometown. She's also a visiting fellow with the International Center for the Study of Political Violence and Radicalization at King's College. And up until recently, she worked with the Terrorism and Security Project of the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. She has a broad international education and also has lots of consultancy work, as does Professor Nielsen. She's a member of the Norwegian Government Commission on Security Policy and Disarmament, a member of the advisory board to the Pakistani Institute of Peace, a consultant on radicalization and violent extremism for the OSCE, and a member of the NATO HFM task group on psychosocial, organizational, and cultural aspects of terrorism. Professor Jorgen Nielsen also has a long CV, which I'll just abbreviate for you, some of the highlights. Professor of Islamic Studies since October 2007, appointed to a 5-year research chair funded by the DNRF, the Danish National Research Foundation, within the theme Islamic European Thought and Modernity at the Faculty of Theology, University of Copenhagen, where he leads the Center for European Islamic Thought. Among the other highlights, I can just underscore that he was appointed Professor of Islamic Studies at Birmingham University, was director of the Danish Institute in Damascus, and has been a cultural counselor at the Danish embassy there in Damascus, that is, for a number of years. Long list of publications. The most recent, in 2009, is the Yearbook of Muslims in Europe, of which he is the chief editor. We'll use the same format as we've used in other evenings previously. Each speaker will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for comments and questions and debate, if we like. So we'll start in the order of the program with Laïla Bokhari. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the University Institute for inviting me to come all the way from Norway and down to continental Europe. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great that such a series, even though it has created a lot of debate. I think that's exactly the debate which is needed as well, difficult as it is to many of us to be in the middle of such a debate. But it is an important debate for many of us to actually take. I want to open up with the opening of a book that I'm just about to complete, and the title of the book is My Brother, the Terrorist, and it discusses many of the dilemmas which I hope we can discuss today, and also which have been in a way implied in the opening introductions. It's just around 8:30 in the morning, 7th of July 2005. It's rush hour in London, and 4 young men by the name Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, Hasib Hussain, and Shahzad Tanvir and Germani Lindsay are on their way to King's Cross Underground Station. 3 of them have driven down from Leeds the same morning, and the CCTV cameras show them arriving at around 8:30. On the back, they're carrying rucksacks with explosives, and they move quickly to the station without getting any attention. 8:50 a.m., the first explosion occurs at the London Underground, and with 50 seconds of difference, the 2 other bombs go off. The last one has problems with his bomb when he goes up to bus number 30. We're all familiar with this story. He's successful in his mission about an hour after the plan. There's total chaos. 52 people are killed in this terror attack, in addition to the 4 perpetrators. Over 700 people are wounded. Short time afterwards, you have 2 video clips which are transmitted on a number of TV stations. They show interviews with some of the suicide bombers, describing themselves as soldiers and warning against further attacks. 1st of September 2005, the TV station Al Jazeera shows a clip of one of the suspected leaders of the group, or these suspected leader of the group, Mohammed Sadiqi Khan, who explains why he's willing to go and offer his life, to sacrifice his life. He explains to a Western audience that he's doing it for Islam, and shows and points to democratically elected governments who are committing crimes to his people, against his people all around the world. Your support to them make you directly responsible, and I am directly responsible to protect and to revenge the acts against my Muslim brothers and sisters. We're in a war, and I'm a soldier, and now you also can feel some of the truth. The number of videos that come out afterwards are stories that they tell before they go into the suicide attacks. And for the first time in this context, we hear the issue of homegrown terrorism as a word being used. The men behind were English, 3 of them with Pakistani origin, 1 of them of Jamaican origin. And the questions afterwards were raised, and a lot of dilemmas were raised, but who had they been in touch with, and not least, where had the radicalization actually occurred? What were they motivated by? A while later, I'm giving a lecture similar to this, and the question I'm asked right afterwards is, Laïla, could this have happened to your own brother? Could it have been that your own brother, educated and Western in every way, could have gone down the same road as Mohammed Sadiqi Khan, etc.? The attacks in New York on September 11th, 2001, but even more than Madrid bombings and the London bombings, 7/7, arguably sent shockwaves through European societies at many different levels for many different reasons. And the attention given to the threat of international terrorism in the last years has had impact, like it or not, on our domestic, regional and global politics. It's also raised a number of questions on the topics of civil liberties, migration policy, security measures, policing and prison conditions. Now, I come from a field of terrorism studies. It's a multidisciplinary field, but it has been debated and criticized for being too military or security focused. I'm not here to defend my discipline at all, but I do think it's important for us as well to ask the questions about our discipline. It's moved from being a very security and military field and developed into involve aspects of other issues, such as why do people become terrorists? What is it that motivates people? Terrorism, as we know, is not a new phenomenon in Europe. In the United Kingdom, Ireland and Spain alone, it's caused more than 5,000 deaths. That's before the last few years. In spite of this, it's seen that I think the fundamental questions that are asked now, the last few years, have only reached the agendas the last few years. It's become even more international, in a way, one can argue, the field of international terrorism. The bomb attacks in Madrid and London clearly demonstrate this point. Now, also arguably, terrorism takes many forms and uses more sophisticated and deadly organizational techniques, so it's become more an issue on the international agenda. Some of the questions which we ask in the counter-terrorism field is, how has cooperation on counter-terrorism been stepped up? and one of the many weaknesses, I think, is seen exactly in this field. How have individual freedoms been safeguarded as we have lived through the aftermath of serious incidents? What terrorist networks actually exist, and what are the making of us as analysts? And are there new attacks to be feared, and how can we prepare for them? How can we prepare resilience in society? Now, it's seen that it's only after 2003, especially after 2003 in European countries, that contributed to the invasion of Iraq, that these countries were exposed to terrorism by Europe's second generation jihadists, so-called homegrown terrorists. Most of them were people of North African and Pakistani origin, but they also included people from other backgrounds, such as Turks, ethnic Europeans, and East Africans. Some of the jihadists took orders from Al-Qaeda and associated groups in Pakistan, whereas others were linked to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and other Al-Qaeda associated groups, such as the Moroccan Islamic combatant groups. Or they acted independently. Some of the second generation jihadists managed to evade the radar of the intelligence services and have been seen to be behind operations in Spain, the UK, and Holland. Although they were raised, and importantly, although they were raised in European countries and had no personal experience of holy war or jihad in their countries of origin, they became educated in the history and ideology of jihadism by radical preachers in Europe or by accessing Islamic or jihadist websites. Several terrorist cells managed to reach Al-Qaeda's re-emerging training infrastructure, particularly in Pakistan, in the Pakistani tribal areas. And although they were European, they tended to be especially concerned with the situation for Muslims in their countries of origin. For example, many of the Pakistanis, or the British Pakistanis involved in terrorism in the UK, were ardent supporters of holy war or jihad in Kashmir and Afghanistan, and trained with Pakistani groups. Similarly, members of the Madrid cell expressed hatred against the Moroccan kingdom. The failed train bombers in Germany had links with Fatah al-Islam in Lebanon, and the Swedish-born terrorist Mirza Karadzic returned to his native country to acquire explosives and skills. Despite some level of affiliation with local groups and motivations, it was clearly global causes, such as the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, and in addition, diaspora developments, such as the arrests of Islamists and the Muhammad cartoon issue, that appear to have been the main driving forces in this new generation. Now, leaders and Al-Qaeda leaders also contributed to this development, so there is a two-way factor here. Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri issued warnings against individual European countries from 2002, and in bin Laden's April 2004 statement, after the Madrid attacks, Al-Qaeda declared war on Europeans. Since then, several Al-Qaeda statements have addressed injustices against Muslims in Europe and linked them to the crusade against Islam in Afghanistan and Iraq. One can go on, and there are lots of examples here that one can speak of where the injustices and differences and the discrimination in Europe is very much used to motivate people. The clearest example is bin Laden's statement from April 2006, in which he clearly condemns the Danish Muhammad cartoonists, portraying them as part of the crusade, and orders the youth of Islam to kill the cartoonists and punish the Danish government for allowing their publication. As religious justification, he refers to the Salafist jihadist theorist Ibn Taymiyyah's ruling of the death penalty for insulting the Prophet. Now, interestingly, I think, several terrorist acts in Europe in 2004 and since have been justified specifically in the terms of European insults against Islam and this ruling. Another development in the diaspora is mobilization around imprisoned Islamists. There have been, for example, reported plans to attack prisons and free Al-Qaeda-linked Tunisian origin, Nisa Tebelsi, here in Belgium, for instance. And the UK-based Salafist jihadist organization Al-Muhajirun has also portrayed arrests of Islamists as a breach to the security pact between Europeans and Muslims in a justification for jihad. Imprisonment has also been an important individual motivation for jihadists in Europe, part of the Madrid cell, and people who were behind attacks in Europe. Now, this is not problematic, the portrayal of such attacks. The former CIA terrorism analyst, Mark Sageman, who some of you might be familiar with, says that Europe is under threat from what he calls leaderless jihad. And he says, and I quote, angry young European Muslims, primarily from South Asian origin, who are sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, but not necessarily part of it. Another terrorism expert, a British terrorism expert, says we certainly face a greater threat, partly because we have such a large immigrant population, which is more vulnerable to radical Islamic thinking. We are paying the price for giving political asylum for so long to individuals who were wanted for terrorism-related offenses in their own countries. Europol's, I'm sure you're all familiar with Europol, in their 2008 annual report, they say that at least one person is arrested every day across Europe. This is then 2007. At least one person is arrested every day across Europe under suspicion of involvement in Islamic terror conspiracies or attacks. And Europol warned in their report that the UK was recognized as a fertile ground for radical Islamists seeking recruits to their jihadist campaigns, with young radicalized British citizens often used to motivate attacks. Now, I'm the first to say, and this is where you get into the dilemmas and the debates, if you like. Now, I'm the first to say that I am of the opinion that there is a threat of terrorism. Terrible acts such as the London and Madrid bombings have unfortunately been inspired by perverted form of Islam. Now, an important task is how to prevent extremists to gain more supporters. The question is not whether to try to counter violent radicalization and recruitment to terrorist networks. The decisive issue to me is why this is happening and how to do this, counter violent radicalization in the best way, so we don't get a violent circle or a violent circle. There are a number of conferences and seminars on the vital issue of why young men, and it's mostly young men, are drawn into these kind of networks. And my book project is one of those contributions. But there's still a lot of research to be done in this area. However, a number of researchers claim that there are similarities between the roads to different types of extremism. The route may be specific for each individual, but the common factor is often a sense of being left outside. Extremists draw on these feelings and promote them, shaping a picture of society where all others are against them. And this is common whether extremists are inspired by right-wing, left-wing, or so-called religious or Islamist fundamentalism. Labels are, again, difficult in this field. Discrimination, feelings of injustice, humiliation, stigmatization reinforce this perception in the individual, who as a result is pushed further down the road to violent radicalization. Now, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted in a way when I say that when looking at counter-terrorism strategies, if one is to only focus on Islamist extremism, a horrible term if you like, the feeling among Muslims that they are treated differently could be strengthened. And we've seen this. In fact, confirming the very worldview, and this I think is important, by doing this, in fact, we confirm the worldview that extremists in general are talking about. They're talking about tensions between cultures. Populist politicians are here playing a dangerous game. By moving quickly on measures such as controls on imams and television channels from the Middle East, but slowly on legal justice for individuals, governments are losing confidence among exactly the young men or the young population that we're wanting to engage with. Young men who already feel that they are being treated as second-class citizens. Decision makers in many ways have to show that they take the issue about discrimination and social inequality seriously, and they are ready to act decisively on such issues. Now, one recognizing that terrorism is a challenge, the question in a way in the aftermath of the many years that we've lived through now with the war on terrorism, and I use these inverted commas, it's opened up a number of dilemmas. And some of them are, I think, what are the very factors that shape perception of the terrorism threat in the US and in Europe, if you take them. Are they different at all? How do differences in threat perception influence policy making? It's one of the issues which in academia I think we're also now increasingly looking at. Is it the case, for example, that in the US and the European and its European allies, they agree on the principle of homeland security and counter-terrorism, but they just pursue these ideas with a different intensity? These are some of the debates which I think are going on between Europe and the West. Or do they disagree more fundamentally, in a more fundamental manner? I'm concerned with one, the shaping of policy as a result of how we perceive threat, but also I'm concerned about the role of scholars in these debates in various countries. And this I think it was brought up in the initial email as well, distancing from such discourse matters in shaping policy, but also in the way we understand the phenomena, such as terrorism. Our advice and the focus that we put on phenomena are listened to. Our focus and perception is therefore important. As I've already mentioned, a strategy to counter terrorism that reinforces the exclusion of and discrimination against young Muslims won't work. We are going down the wrong path if we don't look at the dilemmas in this. Now, there are a number of issues we want to bring up when it comes to dilemmas, and I'll just mention two of them. The one is privacy issues. And there's an issue, there's the topics within surveying of the internet and taking action against extremist literature and the media, which is constantly being brought up. It's a dilemma when we know that much of radicalization is taking part on the internet. But what's the balance here? I'm a strong believer of the free press or free debate and projects that are being involved in countering extremism, countering radicalization and countering terrorism in countries such as Pakistan, but also in Britain. Look at, the emphasis here is rather to have more messages than fewer. So opening up the debates, the many debates that are going on in societies, opening up the radio stations, internet pages, etc. And hoping that in this way the arguments will win, the best arguments will win the debate in such a battle of debates. It requires emphasis on motivating role models in this, investing in learned spokespersons, etc. Now there are other issues within the privacy issue which are constantly brought up, and that's, for instance, the issue of data retention directives, which recommend storage of information on telephone calls and emails, etc. The European arrest warrant, etc., makes it possible for the authorities in one member state to call for the arrest of a suspect in another member state. The number of directives and other issues which have become, as a result, I think, of the heightened security. Many of these measures are undoubtedly important, and the job is here to, I think, to communicate to the public. If I were someone in the security agency or the government, to communicate to the public why they are important, to avoid suspicion. For example, the fact that I think there is a lack of information about the highly successful intelligence work and cooperation that has been going on between intelligence agencies in Europe that undoubtedly has prevented and averted a number of serious attacks. Now there needs to be a balance on this issue as well. And secondly, and I'd be interested in the other panel members' view on this, we have a tendency to interpret, and I fall into that as well, interpret a number of these issues with religious labels. Religion becomes, in this way, securitized constantly. Yes, to some extent, that is true, but we should also be careful when we do this and vary about it. There are clear tendencies, as some of my colleagues have pointed to, a globalized community of Islam and being used as well by young Muslims and leaders of militant organizations. Where religion is disconnected from their cultural context, and religion has become, in a way, an important notion. It's become an important currency to inspire and to get sympathy among young Muslims. But the real reason, the real topic, I think, goes to go beyond this and go under and to see why people are motivated. It's also interesting to look at, and a colleague of mine is working on an interesting research project here, is to see that recent debates in the so-called migrant immigrant issues, and I speak here of cases that we know best from the UK and Norway, the debates on hijab, etc., or the headscarf, have been held. The debates and the arguments have been held very much on secular arguments. What do I mean by that? The arguments, for instance, on the debate of the hijab, the arguments used by even the promoters, or the ones most in favor of having the hijab, have been very much on secular or rights issues, human rights issues, freedom of expression, individual rights, human rights, parts of democratic societies, etc. And not the argument of religion, for instance, that it says in the book, the Quran, etc. Now, why is this an important point? I think it's first and foremost important because it's debates that we're all, in a way, that we all share, debates about civil liberties and rights for all, etc. And if we move down this road, it must be easier to tackle some of the dilemmas that we've been faced with. I'll end with that, Peter, and then we can get into some topics.
Very good. Thanks very much. Let me give immediately the floor to
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity, and particularly thanks for that introduction. I was very much wondering what the underlying agenda of this course was. And if one looks simply at the titles in the program list, that doesn't help clarify much. But you certainly help clarify at the beginning, which means I can drop my first paragraph of notes. I just happen to have come out of 2 days of consultation with a mixture of academics, people working for the Internal Security Services, the Ministry of Integration, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a couple of people from the Swedish Defence College in Copenhagen, discussing the discourse of radicalism, mean, we talk a lot about radicalism and radicalization, processes of radicalization, but what do we mean? We were trying to get the whole discussion back to point zero and discuss what do we actually mean by radical, especially in a country where one of the smaller middle of the road political parties, been around for 100 years almost, is called the radical left. You join that, are you radicalized? When I was younger, I used to work occasionally. I lived in Beirut for 7 years. I used to do the occasional bit of work for the, don't misunderstand me, for the PLO. Was I radicalized? I said, I have a suspicion that if I were to do it now, it might be illegal. It wasn't then. And if one looks, Laïla has already hinted that, of course, if you're talking about terrorism in Europe today, all the focus is on Islamic terrorism. That was intended as the subject of this session. But if we look back through European history of at least 100 years, we can go back to the anarchists of the 1870s, 80s and 90s, we have a long line of European experience of various forms of terrorism. A terrorist attack, depending on your definition of terrorism, but a terrorist attack is generally assumed to have been the trigger that started the First World War. And certainly in the period since the Second World War, within my living memory, I can remember periods when of Croat terrorism, Armenian terrorism, Palestinian terrorism, obviously, and then, of course, above all, the period of the 70s with Baader-Meinhof, Waterbergarden, Red Brigades, Red Army factions, etc., not to mention the Weathermen and others across the Atlantic. So in many ways, we're not dealing with something new, but we're dealing with something with a new brand name. And that's what's attracted the attention, which is why we're here, and which is why I've somehow or other got involved in it, because I've been working on Muslims in Europe since the late 70s, when I started at Birmingham. Incidentally, one of the people who was resourcing this two-day consultation was Mark Sageman, a fascinating character, and his next book's going to be very interesting about blobs and bogs. I'll leave that one in the air. Basically, the conclusion we arrived at, I don't think nobody dissented from the suggestion that violent countercultures arise out of the interstices in contexts where society is going through significant destabilizing changes. And if one looks at Islamic history, which was where I started my academic career, you essentially have a history of a long period of stable, reasonably quiet, certainly in religious terms, reasonably quiet civilization. You've got the usual territorial dynastic wars that we also have in Europe. Very occasionally, though, something slips. And you get a wave, a very radical movement, a revolutionary movement appearing, which lasts for about a generation and then sinks back into itself. Already within the first generation of the death of the Prophet, there was the Khawarij, a movement, small movement, which ultimately got defeated, but which had the idea that anybody who in any way disagreed with them was fair game for assassination. Now, this sounds familiar to some of the modern phenomena. And these kinds of movements have appeared at various points through Islamic history, kind of making the exception and standing out by being so exceptional. Now, I'm going to try and, all too briefly unfortunately, look at the context of what we're dealing with in the European environment. And I think a lot of what we're dealing with is in the context of significant destabilizing changes. Not only the Muslim minorities, but with Muslim society and political systems generally. First of all, let me just look at very quickly at the facts on the ground. We've just published, as was mentioned, we've just published this year the first annual volume of this yearbook of Muslims in Europe. I'll let you have that. And I'm feeling generous, you can have one as well. No advertising. Our country reports, covering 37 countries, starting from the west and about as far over the middle of Europe as 37 countries will take you, not including Iceland, but including all of the European Union, including Cyprus, and we've been cheeky to include Northern Cyprus in our reports. You're basically looking at, you're looking at two Europes in many ways. You're looking at a total population of less than 25 million Muslims, who make up, and I'm not including Turkey here, who make up somewhere between 4.3 and 4.6% of the total population of the countries concerned. Now this includes, though, right, it's not Turkey, but it does include countries like Albania, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Montenegro, and Northern Cyprus, where there are substantial Muslim communities. But I've already indicated there, hinted, that we are actually here talking about two very different Europes. There are those countries where the population of Muslims stretches, possibly in the French case, to 7%. And then there's a gap. The next one up the line is somewhere between 12.5% and 13%, and that's Bulgaria. And then you move further up until you get to, well, Albania's got 70, Kosovo's got 88. But you're immediately there, once you get past Bulgaria, you're immediately talking about European countries, where Muslims are not immigrants. Muslims are an integral part of the society, have been part of the society for centuries. They are as European as the rest of their societies. Post-Cold War, certainly, these countries also have started to receive immigrants from majority Muslim countries outside Europe, but that still remains a new and quite small phenomenon. But I'd suggest that since the end of the Cold War, there's been a convergence between East and Western Europe, in some sense. In the West, we had the sense, after 1945, that our nation-states, in all their variety, had reached some form of stable identity after centuries of feudal, religious, national and ideological struggle. In Denmark, we knew what it meant to be a Dane in the 50s. In France, one knew what it meant to be a Frenchman. In the Netherlands, etc., etc. The Brits never knew who they were, but it wasn't a question that really concerned them. That only started concerning them after people started talking about Scottish and Welsh devolution. And suddenly the big question was, whoa, what's it mean to be English now? With all these other bits hiving off on the edges. In Eastern Europe, similarly, especially in the Balkans, we had a long history of internecine strife. Eastern Europe similarly seemed to have reached, after 1945, a form of stability. The solidarity of the international solidarity of the proletariat had replaced the national, ethnic, religious conflicts of centuries of Balkan wars. So there again, at least superficially, one thought one had arrived at some kind of goal. But in the West then, that sense of stability didn't last more than about 20 years. Because in Western Europe, it gets destabilized by growing immigration in particular. When I was a teenager in school in Copenhagen, I had a Baptist classmate, and the question was always posed of him, how can you be Baptist and Danish? A Dane is surely Lutheran. In those days, 97% of the population were Lutheran, of sorts. But his being a Baptist was a serious question. His being a Baptist, his Danishness has now been saved by Muslim immigration. and settlement, because of course now the question that, well, it used to be posed of him is now being posed of them. And so the national project, which we thought had reached its goal in the period after 1945, was suddenly up for grabs again. And in Eastern Europe, after the collapse of the Soviet system, it turned out that somehow or other those old ethnic, religious, national, atavistic rivalries had only been kept in suspension or been kept under control by the pressure of it being screwed on by popular socialist governments. And 89 to 90 is, in my view, the turning point. The collapse of the Soviet system and the end of the Cold War. Happens to coincide with the affairs. The Rushdie affair in Britain and the headscarves affair in France. And what we see here, quite apart from anything else, is the first public manifestation of what sometimes absurdly gets called the second generation of immigrants. They're not the second generation of immigrants. You're an immigrant or you're not an immigrant. They were the children of the immigrants. They were the young people who had grown up in British or French school systems. And you can look at it, simply demographic. The 1981 UK census showed that among ethnic Pakistanis, or rather technically of people living in households where the head of household was born in Pakistan, called an ethnic Pakistanis, that the largest single 10-year age group was the 6 to 15-year-olds. That was in 81. The 10-year age group above that was smaller, and above that smaller, and above that smaller again. In 89, that age group, that bulk, that first peak, was growing into adulthood, coming out of school, going into the labour market, finding themselves being discriminated against, and rebelling. It was disappointed expectations. And it was quite marked that in the demonstrations against Rushdie, in the streets of Birmingham, London, Bradford, elsewhere, the imams and the community leaders, the Muslim community leaders, across the board were remarking, we've never ever seen these young men in the mosques. They suddenly appeared out of the woodwork. They were being mobilized. And during the early 90s, certainly in Britain, the various aid projects that were being set up to help Bosnians during the first Bosnian War as Yugoslavia was falling apart, that it was the aid projects that were being set up then that were the big recruiters to the banner of Islam, much, much more successfully than were the mosques. And then, of course, as we come into the 90s, at the geopolitical level, Islam becomes the new enemy, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and we end up with a whole set of essentialisms being thrown into the public discourse. Islam is like this, Western democracy, liberal, secular, etc., is like this, and the whole thing builds up to a kind of, the discourse becomes discourse of clash. And so across the continent, in various ways, the questions around relations between national identity, ethnicity, religion, law, citizenship are all again opened to debate, and sometimes to bloody debate, as in the case of former Yugoslavia. The 11th of September becomes a tipping point in this. I mean, in many ways, I mean, if you went to Italy in 2002, 2003, people did not regard the 11th of September as the big crisis in terms of the relationships between Islam and Muslims and Italian society. The big crisis has come a year earlier. A big debate over Oriana Fallaci's book attacking Muslims as being fundamentalist and anti-democratic. It was only gradually, with the development of a war and so on after 11th September, and Italy's involvement in the war against terror, that the 11th of September delayed becomes a tipping point in Italy. The 11th of September, yeah, I mean, it starts all kinds of things. But in many ways, the importance of 11th September here is not in what it itself was, but in the iconic value that gets attributed to it. Remember, Islam does not become a security issue after the 11th September. It has already started to become a security issue in the previous decade. The Dutch Internal Security Agency, I think it was 93, published a report where it looked at future threats against Dutch society and Dutch democracy. It identified leftists, but that's a dying breed by the time you get to 93. It's seriously concerned about right-wing fascism and nationalist extremists. But it also indicated the possibility, no more than that, the possibility of trouble coming from among young, marginalized, angry, disaffected Muslims. It also suggested the solution. The solution was not security. The solution was to adopt social, political, various other policies which strengthened inclusion, recognition, and the sense of equal worth among such people. And of course, the British Anti-Terrorism Act of 1998, passed in response to the Omagh bombing in Northern Ireland, was by many observers at the time seen as being as much targeted against the Muslims as it was against dissident Irish Republicans. And what's happening as this all comes out into the open in the 90s, is that the relationship between the religious and the secular is again contested. Here's another area where we thought in the 50s and the 60s that we knew where we had arrived at and what we had arrived at was good. To use the language of 1066 and all that. It was a good thing. But it didn't last. In the 90s, the relationship between the religious and the secular in the public space is again open to discussion. Question marks are being raised against it. Indeed, question marks are increasingly being raised about where is the public and where is the private. The borderline becomes increasingly fluid. And we've seen symptoms of this fluidity quite recently. I mean, the recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights finding that the presence of crucifixes in Italian public spaces, like schools, was a breach of various articles of the European Convention on Human Rights. We've seen it in a recent English court admitting the possibility that a climate change believer had rights under the European Directive Against Religious Discrimination. And it was bound, the moment you start talking about legislating against religious discrimination, the moment you start legislating for whatever good reasons against religious hate speech, it is inevitable that sooner or later a court is going to have to decide what constitutes a religion. And why should only the traditional established religions have that privilege? I mean, all of those established religions at one time were not established. It also feeds into wider discussions that we've also experienced in recent years. The question of God in the draft EU constitution. Arguments about the acceptability of certain politicians, I think again with the Italian one, as whether they were appropriate to certain directorates as EU commissioners, with reference to their Catholic views on family values. The debate around Sharia so-called courts in England. The Swiss referendum, has it taken place yet on minarets? It's sometime this week, isn't it? Sometime this month. The Swiss have been asked to vote on whether to allow minarets in the public space. It'd be interesting to see what the European Court of Human Rights says when that one comes to them. And we have burqa commissions then taken in France and in Denmark. Somebody suggests that burqa should be forbidden in public space, and immediately it's the standard government practice in these situations when they want to avoid embarrassing decisions. They kick it into the long grass in the form of a commission. The trouble is these commissions report sooner or later, and the Danish one is reporting after New Year. And then we can go through the whole moral panic again. But the moment you start touching on this, you have to go back to the question, what do we actually mean when we talk about secularism? Perhaps it's better to begin with a broader term of secularization, which is the process where the traditional monopolies, state and church, have gradually lost their power over social, their authority over social, political, scientific and cultural matters. But when we look at our own history on the development of secularism, the secular ideas in the European history of ideas or European politics and so on, we do so with the benefit of hindsight. There were other lines of thought which were prevalent at the same time, say 200 years ago, at the time of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and so on. There were other lines of thought at that time. It's only now that we, with the benefit of hindsight, can look back and see that that particular line has been the successful one. Developments could have gone in other directions. It's really only after 1945 again. It's really only after 1945 that we can really confirm that secularization has won. Because it's only after 1945, through the 50s, 60s and 70s, that church attendance finally collapses in Europe. Church attendance in Britain, France, Germany, Denmark in the 50s and the 60s was very high. American levels. Very interesting comparison. It's really only after the infamous student revolt and all the upsets of 68 and the early 70s that church attendance finally collapses. This is the last victory, is the confirming victory of the process of secularization. But then we have to record that this whole business of public secularization is a European phenomenon. Only. European secularization is a European exceptionalism. It's not the case in the United States. It's not the case, really, if you look at it, anywhere else in the world. Perhaps with the exception of those corrupt Anglo-Saxon societies in Australia and New Zealand. Everywhere else, public religion, well, religion is public. And in various manifestations, it is practiced many times more widely than it is in Europe. We're a weird lot on this continent. But if we then narrow it down and look at political secularism, a footnote here, secularism does not necessarily have to be democratic. We always tend to put these two things together as if democracy and secularism belong together. They don't. The Ba'ath parties of Syria and Iraq, nice authoritarian states, nice secular states, very secular states, until recently they've had to start compromising. There are a number of other authoritarian states which are secular, if not secularist, in some cases. But we tend to, there's a throwaway remark about the secular state, but we look at each European state. There is not one that resembles another. Denmark probably has one of the most secular cultures in Europe. In many ways, the separation between religion and politics in Denmark is almost ideologically, almost ideological and almost, well, not quite, but it's probably one of the places in Europe which is closest to the French model. But I deliberately use the word model here. This secular Danish state, secular Danish society, has a state church. The ministers of the national church are civil servants paid for by the state, appointed under civil service rules, subject to civil service regulations. The Danish church does not have its own managing body, either in terms of administration or in terms of doctrine. It does not have a synod. The closest comparison I can think of is the relationship between the state and official Islam in Turkey. The Danish state has a Diyanet. Try to make Danes understand that. But that's the whole point. When you've grown up inside and got used to a system from the inside, you don't notice its absurdities. You don't notice its internal contradictions. You have to have someone coming from the outside to discover it. Because what's happening is that non-European immigrant communities and their descendants, and above all Muslims, of a variety of colours, by their very presence are exposing some of the absurdities of the inherited, worked out with difficulty, relations between religion and state, and religion and politics, and church and state. And if you look at secularism around Europe, it's actually two different animals. Political secularism can either be a framework, as for example in the German case, which isn't opposed to religion, but it's a framework which allows all the various religions free space on an equal basis within the religious market in the country. The other kind of political secularism is the one that is ideologically founded and ideologically motivated, ideologically formulated, and one suspects that some sectors of the French laiciste movement tendency is an ideological secularism, which is not concerned about the framework, but which gets down into the arena to fight against the religious component, the religious tendencies in society. So all of this comes under challenge with the new situation, and further dimension to the new situation. Where do these non-European immigrants come from? Where do these communities come from? They come from the other end of the old imperial nexus. Even in the case of Germany. By the time we got to the end of the 19th century, there was a pseudo-imperial relationship between the German Reich and the Ottoman Empire. Deeply economic. And further than that, the Ottoman armies were very often officered by German officers. After the war started, the Navy was officered very often also by German officers. Before that, British officers had been running the Ottoman Navy, while German officers had been running the Ottoman army. Many more secular military dictatorships. If you look at Islamic history, and I won't bore you with the details, if you look at the 1400 years of Islamic history, there are resources there for a secular discourse. Right back to the time immediately after the death of the Prophet, there were concepts of two types of governor of the provinces. There were two kinds of governor. There was a governor responsible for taxation and administration, who was the secular governor. And then there was the military governor, the leader of the campaigns, who was also the leader of prayer. 600 years later, administrative handbooks describing the government of Egypt, and there's like 15 volumes one. It was fascinating reading, if you're into that kind of thing. They had military and civilian government officials, as we did in Europe. Men of the cloth, men of the sword. But the men of the cloth consisted of two categories, a religious and a secular. Anybody in Arabic? The words used were dini and dunyawi. The Ottoman legal system had two parallel parts, the Sharia part and the secular Qanun part. There's a long history of resources that exist in Islamic history, which are there ready for the taking in the right circumstances. The circumstances contribute to decisions of what particular view comes to the fore. And it's very difficult for those resources to be tapped in an environment where you're living with two opposing narratives as we experienced during the cartoons affair. I was in Damascus at the time. Liberal democracy and absolute freedom of expression. Religion shouldn't interfere in politics. That's the European narrative. You can understand why when you look at European history. On the other hand was the narrative of Islam, Arabs, symbolized in the Prophet, always being persecuted, being done down by the West. Two different narratives running on parallel tracks where it's extraordinarily difficult for the two to meet. But if you look at, get behind the essentialist ideological polemics, if you look at the stuff on the ground, it's much, much more complex. There's some fascinating opinion polls taken among Muslims being published in the last 2 or 3 years, where one, for example, was published just last April, I gather, asks British Muslims, self-defined, how strongly do you identify strongly with Britain? You identify strongly with Islam? And the answer is, you know, the usual 5, not at all to much. And interestingly, when you give them, when you put this question not as alternatives, but as parallel, British Muslims identify, among all European Muslims, identify the strongest, 80%, with their country. But they identify the same strength with their religion. And apparently see no contradiction. If you ask, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, The Economist published a kind of a summary of, again, within the nationality debate, what does it mean to be English now that the Scots and the Welsh are hiving off? Or, alternatively, what does it mean to be British at the time when you're trying to hold these things together? And one of the questions was list 3, 4 things, whatever, that you regard as typically English. It was almost caricatured. The white working class answer, fish and chips and football. It's the Asians, Muslim, Hindu and Sikh, who answer freedom, political pluralism, and these things. And so you've got a number of opinion polls around different countries in Europe, not just in Britain, different countries in Europe, who seem to indicate the same direction. But in the polemical debate that we have, it's more strongly in some countries than in others. The one in Denmark is absolutely absurdly polemical. Those things are pushed aside, they're ignored. They don't fit the agendas of the nationalist political right in the relationship to Islam. And so long as those Muslim voices, which I would argue are actually a majority, and research would back me up, that those Muslim voices which are in favour of all that the rest of us talk about when we talk about European values, so long as they are not allowed to come to get a public profile, so long as they are not acknowledged or recognised, the marginalised, angry young men will continue to get support, will continue to be given safe houses, will continue to find sympathy both among their cohorts, their friends, what Mark Sajman calls the blob, as well as out in the wider Muslim world. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much to both Jorgen Nielsen and Laïla Bokhari. The floor is open. I get to ask a question first. As a chair, we have really 2 stories being told here. One is, and I'm wondering how compatible they are, complementary or in conflict they are. One is, Laïla's story is about a kind of personal crisis of a number of individuals, the story of radicalization and motivation for terrorism and its different manifestations in Europe. And then the other story, Jorgen's story, is one about identity crisis, you might say, a long-term, festering collective identity crisis, which in some sense sets the stage for the tensions that we're living in today. And perhaps the radicalization crisis falls within the identity crisis. And that's a bit of my question. Do you accept, first of all, do you accept this characterization, both of you? And do you think that these two are in conflict? Is the radicalization explanation, the radicalization narrative compatible with the long-term European identity crisis narrative that we're seeing? Then I have a second question really to both of you, which is a bit more pragmatic, and that is, and you both evoked the way this kind of crisis has been securitized. Why has security appeared as the answer of the status quo? Why is securitization the response? Does that grow out of the nature of the problem, or does it grow out of the nature of society or the structure of security making in Europe? So two questions that you're both welcome to respond to or not. And then the floor is open, of course.
I mean, I start very briefly to say I think our two stories are complementary. Mine is the context. Laïla's is the hardcore in which that which plays out in that context.
I'll just agree, but I'll just say that, yeah, you have the individuals, then you have the context, and one does not come without the other. The context and history that shapes society, that shapes individuals, and the narratives as well. I focused on just a part of the narratives that I've heard of the stories that I told. The narratives point to both. They point to the identity crisis in society and identity crisis within as well. To your second question, why it's become securitized. I think it's an issue of who, in simplistic ways, about what institutions in society grabbed the challenges in some ways. I think it became a discourse within the security framework, within the police and the military, in one sense, that securitized the issue. It's only afterwards, or maybe behind all the big words, that you see the discussions going on within the more within civil society, etc. Not that they were not there, but the headlines were made by intelligence services, by the security framework of society, and that, I think, shapes the discourse and the way that the debate was going on. That's what I would do.
Can I respond on that? Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And we have, quite concrete instances of it. Part of it arising out of unfortunate circumstances, coincidences of things happening at the same time. When the Cold War ended in Britain, MI6, which is the external security agency, intelligence agency, was concerned about what it was going to do now. And within the following decade, the Irish insurgency was beginning to run towards an end, and MI5, the internal security agency, was beginning to wonder what it had to do. And there was some serious turf wars in Britain between MI5 on the one hand and the police, both nationally and regionally, and particularly the police's special branch, over who was to deal with. And the first challenge, of course, came with the first Iraq War. And it was only over the following, through the 90s, that some heads were knocked together and coordination was put in place. But it was interesting that at the time of the first Iraq War, there was a lot of worry about Iraqi fifth columnists among the large Iraqi student body in Britain. What was a special branch were going out picking up suspect Arabs, or maybe the other way around. MI5 was going out picking up suspect Muslims, or the other way. One was picking up suspect Arabs, the other one was picking up suspect Muslims. Both meant the same target group, and in the process, 2 Roman Catholics got picked up. I mean, they really not know what they're doing, and this rivalry over I mean, for MI5 post-IRA revolt, it was in part a matter of survival. And we also know, and this isn't just conspiracy theory, we know that the arms industry, whether we talk about the big American companies or people like British Aerospace, were out very early in the 90s, pushing the story of Islam the new enemy before Huntington wrote Clash of Civilizations. There were confidential meetings, seminars running in London, in which businessmen and the private sector and MPs and civil servants were invited. They were pushing this line, and these seminars were organised by American defence companies. So there's very definitely that dimension to it. And then, of course, there was a series of politicians at various points in various parts of the world, both internationally and domestically, saw a good opportunity that they would be ashamed to pass up on.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting discussions. A couple of comments and a couple of questions. I'll try and bring as brief as possible. First of all, I also received, because my name is at the bottom of the introduction to the lecture series, I also received several emails on the lines that you did, Peter, and my reaction was just the same. This is something that's worth bringing out in the open and should be ashamed of. So I'm glad that you have not succumbed to that particular blandishment.
Oh, I didn't get those emails. I'm disappointed.
My comment is that your narrative perhaps doesn't go back far enough. I mean, if you look back at historical narratives, they don't go back. What you were describing, you could go back from the Battle of Poitiers, the Muslims at the gates of Vienna, and so on and so forth. And indeed, in European terms, you didn't go back far enough either. You could go back to the Battle of Kosovo Field and this whole stirring up of
sorry, it is his fault. I only got 30 minutes, actually 45.
Right, I understand. So, in terms of narrative, I mean, you can look at it in different ways. In terms of the Muslim population in Europe, and I've actually also studied the differences between Muslims in America and Muslims in Europe. Muslims in America appear, according to the Pew report anyway, a couple of years ago, living much better integrated than Muslims here. But if you look at the Muslims in Europe, I always say, use your figure of 25 million as the maximum. And that's probably reasonably accurate, maybe even less. But the problem is not that, and you haven't addressed the issue of perceptions of Muslim immigrant populations. You talked about terrorism, and you talked about Islamization, radicalization, and so on, but you haven't talked about the perceptions of the local population in Europe in relation to Islamic immigration. Small, relatively speaking, the problem is, in my opinion, maybe we disagree, that the Muslim population in Europe is actually concentrated into quite small areas, west of Europe. I mean, you go to Bradford, you know very well, you go to Bradford or Leicester, Rotterdam, parts of Brussels, Marseille, you can name the cities. So the native-born population, or the, if you like, the white French or the white British, whatever you want to call them, their perception is that they are being swamped. And you have to address those perceptions. And until and unless the incomes, the Dutch, become sufficiently integrated, then you are going to have issues with the population. Now, in terms of radicalization, that's another issue. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that particular question.
I think actually you're right. I mean, yeah, in one sense, one throws this in a very, very broad picture, and what is, I say, 4.3, 4.6% across Europe. Yeah, that's not the case in Bradford, Birmingham, Blackburn, or parts of Copenhagen, is it? I think the policy failure there is actually dual. And it goes back to the nature of the immigration, and that's also where the difference with the US comes. I mean, the nature of the Muslim immigration into the US, determined very strongly by US immigration policy, was very much focused on professionals, high earners, university students, university graduates, and so on. So the result is that, apart from the indigenous black Muslim population, it's a different issue altogether in many ways. But there you have well-integrated, middle-class Muslim population. Now, the Muslims that came to Europe were precisely the kind of people that the European economy needed at the time, in the 60s. It was unfortunate, however, that, that's why they were semi-educated, undereducated, uneducated, mostly from villages, small provincial towns, basically being absorbed or potentially absorbed into the working class in British industrial cities, which means that they come with low skills, including low social, political, etc. skills, therefore difficult.
Let me just interrupt you 1 second. The problem is that their children and grandchildren are also like that, and which is the fault of the welcoming society.
I was going to say there's a double policy failure. One part of the policy failure is precisely the policies of integration. It was assumed naively in all European countries, each in their own ways, it was assumed very naively that that would take care of itself. In some countries, I think it's arguable that Britain has made a lot of efforts in terms of adjusting its educational system to the new situation, not to mention adjusting the education of the immigrant children, probably less so. Other countries may have done more than that. The whole debate about multicultural education, anti-racist education, multi-religious education, etc., etc. Britain tried busing and gave it up in the 60s. But the other element of the policy failure is the abandonment of the white working class. And that comes together because the industries into which Muslims were recruited into Europe were those industries which were becoming marginalized in the 70s and the 80s. They were being recruited essentially, they couldn't know it at the time, but they were recruited into permanent unemployment. And so you get situations like those in some of the northern cities of Britain, where you have a working class which is underemployed, abandoned, which is part white, part Pakistani, Kashmiri, mostly. And that's all there is to it. It's a polarized dual population with high rates of unemployment, no hope in the economy, and that's when you then get all the social upset that comes with it, riots, etc., etc. It's very interesting. You've had less of that in recent years in places like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leicester, where the populations are much, much more mixed, not just those two groups, where there's been an economic revival with new industries, new activities, new employment coming in. But again, you still have big problems with white working class estates on the outskirts of those cities, which have been abandoned by the politicians, and where the British National Party is effectively left with a free rein. But the picture varies, because it was interesting in Denmark, with the kind of unemployment that's come up following the financial crisis. The worst hit industry sectors in the Danish economy are construction. But that's not hit the children of immigrants, because they're on the whole not in construction. They're in service industries, which have not seen the same kind of decline. So in fact, if you take across the board, the children of Turks and Pakistanis and Iranians in Denmark have suffered proportionately less unemployment than the population of their age group as a whole, because they have been distributed, the distribution in the various sectors is skewed like that. But I mean, it's part of this business. You focus on Islam, you focus on immigrants, and you forget that there's another part of the equation, the abandoned white working class. And the two feed off each other.
There's another, just to add, one is the issue of economic background, or what kind of population that is part of the immigrant background of the immigrant community. And that is the political background of the countries from where the people are coming from, the immigrants are coming from. It's said that the countries where you have tensions at the moment in Europe, are in populations where people have other conflicts, Iraq, other issues, which they carry with them, some of the unresolved conflicts in their countries, and they use them, Somalis, etc. So in these populations, you have some of the most difficult tensions which are brought back here, issues which have never been solved back home in the parents' generation, maybe they're still there. So that I think is a factor as well to look at why it happens among certain populations and not others, and shouldn't be underestimated. And that's why, and it's also, these issues are also used symbolically, of course. They're used to bring sentiments out, so that even if so the Pakistani second generation or British Asians would use the Kashmir conflict as one of the main issues that have not been resolved, etc. As a long-standing issue, in addition to.
And that's about the only point where they agree with their parents.
Yeah.
Disagree on virtually everything else.
So that's an element to this.
I wanted to pick up on the model you were using, because thinking about the most recent incident in the United States, where you had somebody who isn't disenfranchised, highly professional, not a young guy, but middle-aged, in the military-industrial complex, in his heart, doing something which is interpreted by the American press as a terrorist act. We could also say this was a nutcase, that would be maybe our reaction. But the Americans are taking it up as this is terrorism, this is at-home, homegrown terrorism, because it's somebody who seems to have been motivated for religious motives. And I was very interested in your idea. Well, Europe's problem is that it went through this becoming secularized, and so the polemic is so infected in part because it's this confrontation with, well, how secular actually are we when we're challenged by religion. The United States has had this kind of dream of religious tolerance and being a particularly religious. So if people who are practicing Muslims in the United States experience that this is okay because they're religious, then they believe in God. And so in the United States, this is all okay. And there hasn't been this infected polemic about wearing veils and so forth that you see in Europe. And now we have this incident, and I'm wondering how your frame works with this. Will we see, nonetheless, some kind of reaction against Islam in the United States, despite the fact that the populations are so diverse, and you haven't had this kind of organization against Islam polemic that you have in Europe?
I think it's too early. Yeah, I think it's too early to say. But I'll quote Mark Sageman because he referred it to yesterday morning, and he said he doesn't see that happening because, for heaven's sake, the Americans know that Muslims are not like that, because they've all got, certainly in the cities, they've all got Muslim neighbours and they visit each other between churches and mosques, etc. I mean, he's exaggerating slightly. He's playing to the gallery. But he does that a bit, yeah. But that people know enough. And it's very easy in the US situation anyway to draw direct parallels between that and Columbine High and various other similar incidents which have nothing to do with religion. I mean, it's another one of them.
But the interesting thing is that the press is not doing that. At least I've read Time and I've read Newsweek, and they both were saying this is like in Europe, this is Islam terrorism. And will we have more Islam terrorism? Whereas my reaction was just what you said. Well, we had Columbine and we had the guy. This kind of killing is endemic to American violence and not necessarily to religion.
I mean, it depends on how it feeds off each other. These things can kind of just spiral in a kind of feeding frenzy. On the other hand, there will be papers that are trying to push that line, and when they don't get a reaction, drop it. And I think it's too early.
Yes. Thank you. It's been very interesting. I wanted to take Mr. Nielsen back to the comment about our weird continents and our short historical memory and the general longer-term memory. But there's often discussion of the fact that this memory is faulty and does not actually relate to what either happened or...
Memory is a myth.
Yes, memory is not fascinating. But I wanted to know whether you thought there was a role for education in history and religion, or whether the emphasis was much more strongly to be put on integration and social policy and education, to education, but the integration issue rather than education within religion. Does that make any sense?
I don't see them as alternatives. I don't think it's neither or. I think it's complementary.
Is there actually a role for the education of
It's,
people in their own religion?
I think they're complementary, but it is a big debate within the area of people who look at de-radicalization or rehabilitation of former terrorists, etc. There's a debate about what should be the focus, and that's exactly what I'm saying. Should it be on religious deprogramming or changing the view? Should you get religious scholars in, learn or our part of religious scholars, whatever, all these things about to do that, or is that actually going to the basis of the issue? Is that going to the very core of the issue, which might be other issues, integration issues, etc. There's a whole debate on it. I think you need both. In the programs I've looked at, which have been successful, you've had both in Europe and
how practically could that be delivered in Europe? Because I think some of the devaluation in Saudi, what have you, is slightly being devalued by the fact that it involves money and wide and resettlement in there.
Yeah, but there's so much more to
contact. Yes. So I was just wondering how you deliver it here, because it's the same sort of approach.
And I think it's true to say, is it not, that the homegrown terrorists, since we're using that term, normally have not grown up within a practicing Islamic environment. They have not had an Islamic religious education. They haven't been to mosque schools, at least not since they were 11, and they begin to get boring. And it's not young people who have been through, who have had a steady Islamic environment throughout their teens and young adulthood who have got involved in this, in the European environment. I mean, it was funny, after 7/7, I got a phone, the Independent asked me to write a piece for the next day, do we now need to close down all the Islamic schools because this is... I said, no, you don't, because there's no evidence that any of these people came out of Islamic schools. If anything, Mohammed Sadiq Khan was a teaching assistant in one of Tony Blair's local community youth clubs. If that logic was to be applied, they should all be closed down.
Can we do comparative religion as an education policy within Europe?
Cool, that's it. I mean, it's interesting. There was a few years ago, the French government suddenly got into a panic because it discovered, because of the privatization of religion since 1905, kids didn't have religious education and therefore could no longer understand the mass of the French cultural heritage. They couldn't understand the paintings they were seeing in the Louvre because they didn't know the biblical stories or anything behind it. So they set up a small commission, led by, of all people, Brigitte Debray, to look at the reintroduction to what to do. And he actually, the commission, actually recommended that religious education be reintroduced into this French state school curriculum that then sank without a trace. The problem with religious education, single or multi, is that you immediately get the power interests and political interests of the church involved. And there's this confusion between teaching religion for the believers and teaching about religion. Now, teaching about religion is difficult enough, but they are two different approaches. And the trouble is that the religious communist leadership don't like professional teachers teaching about their religion without them having a say-so, having a veto. I mean, in Britain, the British version is the English version is very, very unusual in the way it was introduced during the 1970s. I mean, in Birmingham, we actually have RE teachers who are RE subject leaders in primary schools that are Muslim women with headscarves, because they set about training, recruiting young Muslim women to be trained as RE teachers. They then go into schools and teach Christianity, Sikhism, Judaism. And initially there was an outcry until someone pointed out the absence of logic in the outcry, because the long tradition of Christian or secular teachers teaching Islam. So that was okay, but Muslim teachers teaching Christianity was apparently not. Didn't last. But it's a political hot potato wherever you go. I think it's politically probably easier to get in through the history curriculum. In my age, we would say the classical languages, but nobody studies classical languages any longer. I just add Arabic to them.
Other comments?
Yes. I also have a question on the idea of education. I don't think educating in integration or religion is good, but you should have more education in law, because you need to understand the society you're in, as well you're a migrant or just a very local person. You need to understand what kind of situation you're in, society you're in, and law is still the
That's
space.
what we call civic education.
Yeah.
Citizenship education. Some countries do it. European.
No, I don't think. I think you will have to say then this is the good way of living or this is the bad way. I just think you need to educate in structures. And this is how it works. If you want to change the law, you have to do this. This is where it comes from. This is how a state is organized.
Most members of parliament don't know that.
One of the most interesting lectures I've ever attended was about how religion is incorporated into lawmaking and the sort of the secular side of the state side. And that, I think, would be a really good bit of basic education for everyone.
Now, there's some serious deconstruction to do there, but people just don't realise. It's this business when the outsider comes in and sees what the rest of us take for granted. People generally do in Europe just do not know how deeply influential the Christian tradition has been and remains in law. You need an outsider to come and tell you. And there's a whole growth area now in the study of religion and law, legal cultures and this kind of thing. But it always takes ages for that to go from university to get into school.
Well, last chance. Going on. Next week, a bit of publicity. Next week, the seminar is on European immigration policies between stemming and soliciting, which was provided by the speakers, that topic, not by the coordinators. And those speakers are Virginie Guéraudon from CNRS in Lille and Christian Jorgen from American University. So before we go, let's give a warm round of applause to